Thank you, and can I add my welcome and thanks for those of you who are early starters. Lovely to see you all. And what a great introduction. I love that the MC apologises for the potty mouth. That is fantastic. And I appreciate an engaged introduction. It gave me a flashback. The last time I was in front of an audience, possibly in this venue, was the Chartered Accountants Conference pre-COVID. And it's fair to say that my MC that introduced me was much less engaged than Yemi, and in fact a tad bored. But he got to the point in my CV where he suddenly sparked up and looked at the audience and said, "Well, this is interesting. Simon spent 5 years in jail." And he promptly sat down and I got up. Now, it may not look like it, but like many people, I still have a slight angst getting up and speaking in front of groups. Well, that finished me off, right? I'm looking at 500 chartered accountants and my MC's just told them all that I spent 5 years in jail. So as I'm having a frozen, awkward moment in front of the audience thinking, oh, Jesus, what am I going to do? This delightful gentleman in the front row got my eye and he gave me a nod and he stood up and he turned around and he looked at the audience and he said, "I would just like to point out that makes him eminently qualified to talk to us about culture." So I was pretty happy about that rescue. I've got a very short amount of time with you today, and I really want to try and not pack in, that's probably not the right description, but I want to share with you a very focused, deliberate case study, if you like, of a particular organisation, the one that I work for now, and that is Australia Post. I am the inaugural Chief Mental Health Officer. I was appointed about 12 months ago. So I'm very glad that I'm now standing here talking with you 12 months later, because I'm learning every day about the organisation that is Australia Post. So what I'm going to do is very briefly talk to you about four things and try and tie some of the key points of what I'm about to share with you to some of the other themes and the content that you've been accessing over the last day. I was here yesterday and I found it absolutely fascinating, saw some great case studies. And so what I'm going to try and do is also reinforce or share a few questions and observations linked to some of the things that hopefully you're all engaged with yesterday. One of the comments I'd make, as you can see, I've been around a little while. It's actually a lot more than 20 years, but I won't tell you how many. But when I first started my career, I was actually a clinician. And if I came to an event about mental health and wellbeing, it was almost entirely focused on the binary concept of mentally ill, not mentally ill. It was a very black and white conversation, and a fair chunk of the content was all about how do we respond once people are either very unwell, ill indeed, or need some sort of support. Yesterday I was again blown away, as I am regularly these days, about how far we've moved into the space of a much more holistic approach to mental health and wellbeing, not just in the workplace but more broadly. I'm not going to take questions in the time I've got allotted because I think that would be quite difficult with this audience. But what I will do is I'm going to hang around for the next couple of hours, and I'm really happy for people to come and say good day and have a yarn about anything that I'm chatting about with you today. Context and complexity is the first thing I want to talk about. I'll talk a little about Australia Post and what makes us complex and interesting in a mental health and wellbeing perspective. I'll share with you the way we're going about looking at mental health across our workforce, and then I've probably, given my sort of broader interest in this space, I'm going to try and link some of that into some key learnings, principles, ideas, questions that I think are really important if you're contemplating taking a contemporary strategic approach to mental health in your own organisations. And then I'll perhaps share a couple of observations about where we're going to be heading and where we want to take our own approach to mental health and wellbeing. Boy, when I joined Australia Post, have we got any Australia Post folk in the audience? I know some of them are coming along. Anyone out there? No, not today. Or you maybe just not putting your hand up. That's okay. Come and chat to me later. It is a beast, and it is a very interesting beast. And one of the things that struck me in my first few months at Australia Post, and this is a dotted line and a segue into one of the key strategic points that I'm going to talk about, and I know some of the case studies yesterday talked about, and that is the connection to purpose. By and large, since the time I worked in the police force many years ago, I've not seen an organisation where there is such a cohesive, coherent sense of connection to purpose. Now, I'll come back to that later, because the notion of encouraging, supporting and really enabling that connection to purpose is at the core of, I think, effective mental health strategy. We've got 70,000 people. Not all of them are employees. We've got people that fit into a range of different categories. We do have a large extended workforce. We have people who work in contractor businesses that are almost entirely connected to Australia Post. And they are, as you all know, all over the country. We've got something like 4,300 postal outlets. You would know them as your local post offices. How many of you got a post office in your community? How many of you love your post office in your community? Okay, that was slightly fewer hands. You can come and tell me what it was, maybe not. But we are a massive organisation. Some of you may not know, we have a legislative requirement to be everywhere. We are required to provide that sort of support and service to the community. Another really critical part in terms of our approach to mental health and wellbeing. You can see the figures, I won't go them, lots of people out there on the road. Safety, more broadly, not just psychological safety, is a really important part of our day-to-day consideration for our workforce. So, we're everywhere, and here's a really important thing as well. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you that we are the most complex or the most unique organisation, because that would be, it would be frankly a bit egocentric and a bit arrogant, to be frank. However, we have some very interesting complexities, and you can see up there the numbers about 134 nationalities. Now, I don't know if anyone can shout out how many countries there are in the world, but I don't think it's a whole lot more than that. We have people in our workforce from all over the place. And sometimes I hear conversations, for example, about, you've got to deal with and accommodate people where English is their second language. We have people who don't have English. We have people for whom English is their third, fourth or fifth language. And we have whole communities working in our facilities that operate on a day-to-day basis without speaking English. It's fabulous. It actually is quite incredible. And when you go out in those environments, it's a real education. One of my senior retail people who's been in the business for a while was talking to me and my team about their mental health needs. And it was a salutary reminder about making assumptions. And he said to me, Simon, this thing about communicating the mental health strategy, you guys are using social media platforms, you're out there, you're really trying to send emails. So why do you think it's not penetrating and getting the message out to our people? And I was initially sitting there feeling very clever about the fact that we had lots of channels of communication. And you look at me and said, what do you think our number one social media platform is? Anyone hazard a guess? WeChat. I had no idea. Absolutely no idea. Now, my only point there is, I'll come to this later when we talk about assumptions about communication. In that 72,000 or so people we've got, not everyone has an email. Not everyone actually has a device. So we have some complexities in that sense. We have around 6% of our workforce identify as having a disability. The number is probably, as you would all understand, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, probably significantly higher than that. Doesn't matter, don't care. As long as what we're able to do is make sure that we are inclusive and integrating people and they feel welcome and safe. I'm proud to say, nothing to do with me, but I can say on behalf of the organisation, we have just been awarded the number one ranking in Australia as a workforce for inclusivity, in particular in disability. We've got whole facilities where there are communities of people with profound hearing loss. And I had a quite emotional experience not long ago at one of our male centres where there may be 1,000 or so staff, and I walked in and I saw lots of people signing. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. You know, are they all people with a hearing disability? No, they're not. In that workforce, people who don't have hearing deficits have learned how to sign, and they are able to actually communicate. Quite extraordinary. The passion and commitment is amazing. Righto, let's get cracking. We've had an interesting journey. I'm not going to talk you through all of this because we haven't got time. But interestingly, there are a couple of points I would like to highlight about the way Australia Post has gone about developing and implementing its most recent and updated mental health strategy. Sadly, and can I say, obviously, whenever I mention what I'm about to mention, I'm well aware that this, for some people, is a trigger. But nonetheless, what I do want to highlight, and this will become relevant later in our strategy, is that we had tragic deaths in our workforce 5 or 6 years ago as a result of suicide. And the view of our leaders at that time was that we really needed to do something about that and to try as best we could to eliminate that risk from our workforce. Now, I'm not suggesting to you, even despite our scale, that rate of suicide should or is in fact one of our indicators of the success of our strategy. I think it's very important to separate those two things. Nonetheless, I work in an organisation for whom the sense of family and connection is the strongest I've ever worked in. And so the notion of at least being aware of the idea that, you know, managing this risk is critical is really important to us. So what that did, when we had a particularly distressing series of events back 5 or 6 years ago, was really trigger us to have a look at how we go about looking at supporting our people across the board. And a series of events then took place, and we have been piloting, growing and building a mental health strategy since that time that is fit for purpose, contemporary, evidence-based, and takes us into the future. Absolutely critical for us. Now, everyone has to have a circumplex, right? This is a very bad coloured circumplex, I know that. However, it is the best snapshot that I can share with you that talks to you conceptually about what is in our mental health strategy. So around the outside, what you can see is that it is firmly based, as I'm sure many of you will have in your own strategies, around psychosocial risk. We are huge. We cannot be all things to all people. We have to be very clear, both ideologically and sort of philosophically, about what is ours as an organisation and what is not. So we absolutely know that we have a range of psychosocial risks, and I'm going to presume, by the way, that you are a comfortable audience when it comes to psychosocial risk. But what we have is a series of risks that we understand, we know, we accept, and we believe that as a workforce we should be accountable for. And I'm going to share those with you in a moment. But of course our process is also about being aligned to the broader Australia Post strategy of social connection, being part of communities, recognising that anything that we do should be about stimulating connection and a sense of belonging, purpose and the like. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this because we don't have time again, but as you would expect, our strategy is equal parts prevention, mitigation, communication, in the moment stuff, and I'll share what I mean by that, but in the moment is critical, and the subtext for in the moment is, do we have leaders, supervisors and managers across the organisation that are confident and understand our approach to mental health and wellbeing? And if there was one absolute central plank to our strategy, that is it. We are completely focused on the power, the influence, the relevance of line management and line supervisors when it comes to the mental health and wellbeing of our people. So naturally, we invest a fair bit of time in both supporting and building confidence and competence. That does not mean we sheep dip. We don't, for example, put everybody through mental health first aid and the like. Because interestingly, every bit of research tells us that the actual skill we need from our leaders and supervisors is the skill of being an effective supervisor. Now, that's not to say we don't do a bit of mental health first aid. We have peer support programs around the business. That is a wonderful skill set. But at the same time, we're conscious of not confusing people about their roles and being absolutely clear about what is important. You all know this one. How many of you have seen this honeycomb? We love it. We always thank the Canadian Mental Health Commission, Guarding Minds at Work, who did us all a favour by giving us, I think, one of the best summaries of what is important and effective when it comes to building an organisational mental health strategy. I heard a case study yesterday. Was it the Fred Hollows Foundation? Can anyone quickly give me a nod? Was that who I was hearing? Fabulous. Really aligned to how they were talking about the importance of the things that matters. We have obviously a massive procurement function within Australia Post. We are inundated, as you would expect, with people wanting to sell us the most current, in their minds, approaches to mental health and wellbeing. But that notion of evidence alignment to an ideological framework that is contemporary and broadly accepted is critical. I'm not going to show you those other than to say our strategy attempts to really provide us some sort of coverage of most of, but not all of these factors. And those of you who have read the Canadian work and the Guarding Minds at Work, you will know this, that pretty close to number one in terms of influencing a strong mental health culture and an approach to mental health is relationship of staff with their line manager and supervisor. So we focus pretty heavily there. That's our picture. Of the psychosocial risks, it's a very complex one. I'm happy to share or take questions about it later. But it'll probably be easier if I go to a couple of these and highlight where we focus our risks. No surprises, we've got the psychosocial risks and hazards that many of you do. Some of them are, more prominent in our organisation for various reasons. Some aren't. But we need to be addressing the things that are relevant. We collect data, obviously, about our workforce, and this is a dynamic, moving feast. But it is very much around some of those critical ones. So let me tell you, here's our top 5 at the moment, and I'll share with you a couple of additional ones that are important. We are going through transformation. Every one of you who's read a newspaper in the last 6 months will know that Australia Post is in a really important stage of its development. You know that issue. If I could succinct it, it would go like this. We used to deliver a lot of letters. We don't deliver a lot of letters anymore. We were a monopoly in letters. We now deliver parcels. We're not a monopoly in parcels. So we are changing to be able to adapt to that. Our legislation also, of course, tells us that we need to be everywhere, and that is an interesting challenge. So, transformation and change management, we all know, don't we, that presents risks to the mental health and wellbeing of our people. Bullying and harassment, sadly, is part of any contemporary workforce. I won't go into huge detail about that, other than to say, I think at Australia Post, we actually have lower rates than many organisations, and, nonetheless, it is still one of our focus areas. The critical one is about job design and unreasonable work demands. So we are front and centre accepting that a good mental health strategy also needs to think about the way in which we design work. Now, at the risk of being slightly controversial, let me give you one example of that. When I was in the police department many years ago, it used to always amaze me that we ran 12-hour shifts. I had a bucket of data that told me this, that if you're out working operationally on a 12-hour shift, most of your incidents, assaults and bad things happen in hours 9 to 12. Why do you think that is? Because we become fatigued or we become cognitively burdened and we are less able to deal with the things that present. Why the hell would you have a 12-hour shift? Well, the answer often is complex and to do with workforce structures and industrial relations. We all know that. Now, that's not an Australia Post example, but nonetheless, it's a reinforcer of the importance of looking at job demands and work demands in a constructive way. Now, we've got other problems. We've got isolation, remote working. This is not just about the idea of trying to incorporate flexible work practices, which is something that we are absolutely focused on and trying to wrestle with. It's complicated, right? We have a whole workforce that are front line. 30 to 40,000 of our people can't work hybridly. They are essential services for all of you folk. That presents very interesting challenges. We also have worked out that a good strategy needs to allocate the right amount of time to things that are important. So, for example, if we are serious about the relationship between staff and their line manager and supervisor, guess what you have to do? That has to be in people's position descriptions. It has to be sacrosanct. We have to set aside time so that we can do it justice. And funnily enough, what do we discover? Not just at Australia Post, but in my previous life, often those things slide out. They become less important and relevant and, not relevant, but less important, and less time is attached. So we're very conscious of it. Again, I won't run you through all of the things that are on that list, and I'm just looking at my colleague to see how long I've got to go down the back there. Not very long, I don't think, but let's jump into a couple of other quick things. I've talked about workload factors. One of the things we've also learned is the importance of choosing carefully how you consult. And one of the things that we're doing is building a consultation model to make sure that we consult with the right people at the right time, and generally broadcast that is an important part of our process. In other words, we've got to answer the question, why should I consult with you? And the reasons are here that people have a contribution to make in relation to their role. All right. This is one of the examples of how we take our model out to the workforce to try and keep it as simple as possible. That we are all about mental health that does these three things as best we can. To support, to promote, and to make sure that we are protecting people's mental health to the best of our ability. As I mentioned earlier, with a diverse workforce, we need to provide these things in the best way that we possibly can. All right, I can see I'm about to be wound up, and I just want to leave you with a couple of quick last comments. What makes a great mental health strategy? This, if I had one slide in a longer workshop, it would be about this notion of balancing wants versus needs. What we are trying to do at Post is really understand, what do our people need? And let me be blunt, that does not always align to what people want. It is about carefully considered consultation and going out with straw models, about taking it to people and running hypothesis testing, checking and having a crack at trying a few things. We're having a crack at peer support programs at the moment. We are looking at a critical feature of our strategy is work groups called psychological safety working groups in every part of our business, which are staff-led, staff-driven and supported by a central mental health team. They are proving to be super effective and really important for us. And the last one is about making sure that we are focused on very efficiently the things that actually make a difference. So, that's my one slide. As much as I would love a couple of cupcakes, and I'm sure we'll get them today, I think that what we are trying to do is make sure we best understand what our workforce and our people needs, and then provide them a strategy that hopefully is what people want, but more importantly makes a difference and is something that is scalable and relevant to our workforce. Wow, I've just run out of breath. Thank you very much. I hope that all made sense. Come and chat to me. Thanks, everybody.